Hi, in this tutorial we're going to look at how you can make your scene transitions look a little bit nicer. We're going to replicate this scene transition from Angry Birds 2. Let's get started. We'll start a new 2D project called Scene Transition. We'll create a Sprites folder and add in the images we're going to use. I have two backgrounds to represent the game and the Angry Birds 2 logo, which we'll use to create the effect. We'll drag in the main menu sprite to create an object and just resize this so it fits our screen. My phone seems to run the game at 20:10 ratio, so that's what I'm using here, so our image fits. In reality, you'll have a proper game you want to add this to. Now in the Scenes folder, we'll rename the default scene main menu and duplicate it to create the level select screen. We can just double click on the level select screen to open it and change the background sprite to the level select one. Let's just jump back to the main menu scene for now. We'll create a new game object which we'll call Scene Transition. This will end up being the prefab we can add to any scene to do the transition. Let's add a new script to this called Scene Transition. And we'll create a scripts directory for that and move it in. Now in the script, we'll start off with the basic code for changing scenes. We'll need a variable scene to load to specify which scene we're loading next. Then in the update method, we'll simply check for pressing F1 using input.getKeyDown, and when this happens, we'll call SceneManager.loadScene and pass in our scene string to determine which scene to load. In order to use the Scene Manager, you need to make sure you've imported it by including the using Unity engine.scenemanagement. Now back in Unity, we'll set the scene to load variable to level select so it knows what scene to load. We need to make sure Unity knows which scenes to include in the build, so we'll open the level select scene, then in the file menu, select build settings and click on the add open scenes button to include this one in the build. Switch back over to the main menu scene, and when we run the game, we start on the main screen, and if we press F1, it switches to the level select screen. Excellent. Now let's add that animation in. Let's take a closer look at the animation slowed down so we know what we're doing. Firstly, the inverted logo rotates and scales in, then the logo is filled with red. When the scene is loaded, it then reverses this process, fading out the logo and rotating and scaling out the mask. Here's that again at full speed. So under our scene transition object, we'll add a new empty game object called transition. I've got this extra layer in here in case you want to have multiple possible transitions, then you could pick and choose between them. First, we'll create a 2D sprite and choose the square. We'll scale this up to something larger so it fills our screen. This will be our background. Next, we'll create a 2D sprite mask, and for the sprite, we'll choose the Angry Birds 2 logo we imported earlier. Back on the background, we can now modify the mask interaction. We'll set this to Visible Outside Mask, which gives us a cutout of the logo like we require. The logo is a bit big, so we'll just scale down the sprite mask to something better. Finally, we'll create the red fill, and again we'll create a 2D sprite and choose a square and scale it up like before. Change the colour to an appropriate red. We want to make sure the fill is behind the background, so we'll set the ordering layer to 100 and the background to 101. I've chosen some large numbers here to hopefully ensure it's above all of your other 2D elements. That's all the elements you need. We'll create the code to modify these appropriately. We'll need a reference to the sprite renderer of the fill sprite so we can change the opacity of the red fill so that we can fade it out. And we'll also take a reference to our transition object so we can deactivate the transition game object when we no longer need it. First up, we'll handle the fade. You could manipulate these objects with animations if you prefer, but I'm a coder at heart, so I'll modify them directly using a coroutine. The fill fade coroutine will take the start and end alpha parameters and the duration you want it to last. The first thing we do is take a copy of the fill color so we can modify it appropriately. Then we have the standard lerp loop, where we start with 0 elapsed time, and then whilst we're less than our duration, we increase the elapsed time and calculate the percent through the change we are. Rather than using lerp, I'm using the smooth step function, so rather than being a straight line, you get a slightly smoothed out curve. We then set the colour of our sprite to our newly created one and yield null, so we process this loop again next frame. After the loop, we ensure that we end up exactly at the end alpha value. We'll add in some code so that we can see what this looks like so far. So we'll create a second coroutine that will drive the fade and then the scale later. This takes in the boolean to dictate if we've just started or if we're transitioning out. Then the scene string so we know which scene to load. We start by ensuring our transition is enabled. Then if we've just started the scene, then we need to fade out, so we yield our fill fade going from alpha equals 1, which is opaque, to alpha equals 0, transparent. When that finishes, we can disable the transition. Else, we're leaving the scene, so we'll call the fade in the opposite direction, from transparent to opaque. As the scenes are essentially empty, we'll add a slight delay here of 1 second before loading the next scene, so our transition isn't too fast. Finally, we'll call load scene with our past scene string. With this new method, we can modify our update function so that rather than loading the scene, we start the transition coroutine when we press F1. We pass false, as we'll use this to transition out of the scene. To remove the transition, we can similarly call the transition coroutine in the start method, this time passing in true, so we get the correct animation. Back in Unity, we can now assign our references to the fill sprite and the transition. We'll create a prefabs directory and drag this in to create a prefab. Then switching to our level select scene, we can add our transition prefab. We just need to update the scene to load variable, which we'll set to point at the main menu. Let's open our main menu scene to start from the right place and take a look at that. Pressing F1, we can switch between the scenes using half our transition animation, and that works great. Now let's dive back into the code and finish off the other half. First up, we need some variables so we know where it needs to move from. So I'll add 3 for the position, rotation and scale for the starting values, then 3 more for the end values. So our scale coroutine will take just 2 parameters, a bool to dictate if we're scaling out or in, and the duration. Again, we have the standard lerp loop, tracking the elapsed time and updating whilst less than our duration. Now if we're scaling out, we go from the start values to the end values. So we'll use a vector3 lerp for the position, a quaternion lerp for the rotation, using quaternion.Euler to convert our Euler values. Finally, the scale is another vector3 lerp. When we're scaling back, it's exactly the same, except we go from the end to the start in our lerp values. As ever, at the end of the loop, we ensure our values are exactly where we want them. So all we need to do is add a call to the scale coroutine in our transition coroutine. When we start a scene, we do the fill fading first, then scale out. So we press true to the scale coroutine. I set the duration at 1 second, which seems about right. Then when we're exiting a scene, we do the scale first and pass in false, as we're doing it in the opposite direction. That's it. Now back in Unity, we just need to find the right parameters for our scale. Because we created it in the right position, the initial transform will be 0 for the position and rotation, and 1 for the scale. To find our desired ending parameters, we'll just modify the transition to get something that works. We want the Z rotation to be 90, so it's on its side, and we want the scale to be big. You can use this lock icon to change all the values at once. I'll set this to 17 as I know that works. Now you'll see that no matter how big you scale it, it'll never fill the screen because of where the center of rotation is. So we'll just counteract this by translating it down a bit. So y equals -8 looks about right. So we can reset this transition now and enter those values into the script. -8 on y for position, 90 on z for rotation, and 17 on all of them for scale. We just need to make sure we apply these settings to the prefab so it's picked up on both scenes. And that's it, we're done. Starting the project and pressing F1, we can toggle between them with the animations playing. Excellent. The animation as I've created here is slower than in the game, so you could speed up the scale if you wanted something more true to form. I hope you found this tutorial useful in some way. As ever, the full code is available on GitHub, and I put a link in the description below. If you have any requests for tutorials, please let me know in the comments. See you next time.